and welcome to Dominican University and to the Siena Center's annual Albertus Magnus Lecture. I am Rachel Hart-Winner, the director of the Siena Center, whose mission is to bring faith and scholarship to the critical issues of the church and society for the benefit of community. And it truly is a pleasure to look out and see you all here with us tonight. This Saturday, on November 15th, the church celebrates the feast of Albert the Great, a Dominican scholar and saint of the 13th century who was at once scientist, philosopher, and theologian. He wrote on a wide range of topics, ranging from botany and astronomy to biblical studies and systematic theology. He was the first European scholar to draw the works of Aristotle into conversation with Christian theology. And of course, he was the great teacher and mentor of Thomas Aquinas. So in 2006, the Siena Center established this lecture, the Albertus Magnus Lecture, to carry on his tradition and to always engage issues at the intersection of science and religion. So we could not be more pleased to welcome our lecturers this evening, Dr. Raine and Dr. Tobias Winright, who will help us deepen the dialogue between science and theology, especially as it pertains to understanding the roots of violence and solutions to decrease violent acts in our society. First, our lecturer, Dr. Raine, joins us from the University of Pennsylvania, where he is the Richard Perry Professor of Criminology, Psychiatry, and Psychology. He received his bachelor degree in experimental psychology from Oxford University in 1977, and his doctorate in psychology from York University in England in 1982. After spending 4 years in 2 top security prisons in England, where he worked as a prison psychologist, Dr. Raine was appointed as a lecturer in behavioral sciences in the Department of Psychiatry at Nottingham University. In 1986, he became the director of the Mauritius Child Health Project, a longitudinal study of child mental health that constitutes one of his key research projects. He came to the United States in 1987 for the position of assistant professor in psychology at the University of Southern California. He was promoted to full professor of psychology, and in 1999 was the recipient of the endowed chair, the Robert G. Wright Professorship of Psychology at USC. Dr. Raine has received many awards, which include the Young Scientist of the Year Award from the British Psychological Society, a Research Scientist Development Award, and an Independent Science Award, both from NIMH. He's also received the Associate's Award for Creativity in Research, the highest award given by USC. He has published 5 books, including the book for which this lecture is named, The Anatomy of Violence, 252 journal articles, and book chapters. He's been the principal investigator on 17 extramural research grants and the main mentor on 9 NIH pre- and postdoctoral awards. He's a very busy man. He has also delivered close to 250 invited presentations in 25 countries. So we are delighted to add Dominican to the list. Our respondent this evening, Dr. Tobias Winright, joins us from a little bit closer, St. Louis University. Dr. Winright joined the Alberta Nangi Center for Healthcare Ethics, where he holds the Hubert Bader Endowed Chair. He's also the Associate Professor of Theological Ethics in the Department of Theological Studies. Dr. Winright is a Roman Catholic moral theologian who has previous professional experience in law enforcement, so a wonderful person to engage Dr. Raine. He's worked in both corrections and policing, and also has experience in lay ecclesial ministry. He has a PhD in moral theology and Christian ethics from the University of Notre Dame, and received his Master in Divinity from Duke Divinity School. Dr. Winright's scholarly interests include Christian bioethics, fundamental moral theology, social ethics, just war theory, capital punishment, and ecology. So another diverse range of interests. Both of our speakers tonight in many ways embody Albert the Great's expansive knowledge. Dr. Winright is also an extensive writer. He's co-authored After the Smoke Clears, The Just War Tradition and Post-War Justice. He also edited Green Discipleship, Catholic Theological Ethics and the Environment, along with co-editing several volumes. In addition, he's authored numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal for the Society of Christian Ethics. Dr. Winright is an active member of the Society of Christian Ethics, the Catholic Theological Society of America, the American Academy for Religion, and the Society for Christian Ethics. So, it's clear to see we have two very distinguished guests tonight. Given all of their numerous qualifications, which I have named, they clearly are the ideal speakers to engage our topic, the anatomy of violence. We are so grateful to both Dr. Raine and Dr. Winright, who help us continue to engage our theme for the year, sin and pathology, theology, neuroscience, and the roots of violence. After we hear from both of our guests, we will have some time for some Q&A, so I hope you think about some engaging questions, and we'll have some time for, for discussion after. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adrian Raine and Dr. Tobias Winright.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at Dominican and to engage you. And I think, first of all, I want to thank Rachel and everyone else at Dominican for inviting me here. I've never given a talk at a theological college before, so you've got to excuse my religious inexperience. I was brought up as a Catholic. I lapsed when I was 15, and please forgive me my sins for lapsing. We have a real expert in Christianity here to dovetail with me and to it's not exactly matter and antimatter, it's science and religion. And it's a dialogue that we want to create tonight, I think, Tobias, isn't it? So we, I think, have as much to learn from you as you have from us. But for me, I'm just a basic scientist. I don't know much more than just basic knowledge, you know? I don't feel I've got an axe to grind or a mission to give you. But what I do want to talk about is the anatomy of violence. And that's the body of knowledge building up, documenting for me beyond reasonable doubt, Tobias, that there is indeed a brain biological basis to crime and violence. And to give you a sense of the structure of what I'll say in the next 45 minutes, first of all, I'll talk about early biological factors that raise the odds that some of us are more likely to become criminal and violent than others. Secondly, I'll talk about, well, what areas of the brain, when dysfunctional, can give rise to crime and violence. And thirdly, I want to engage us all in what are the societal implications of this body of knowledge, the anatomy of violence. And I'll speak to three main areas. First of all, prevention. Secondly, prediction. Thirdly, punishment. Will it change our minds on these three main areas that we engage with in a practical, humane society? Let me begin by talking about early biological risk factors. And early, let's get back to history. Let's get back to 1871 in northern Italy. This man, Cesare Lombroso, an Italian doctor who was fascinated with criminals, fascinated with the idea that there may be a biological brain basis to crime. Now, he didn't have brain imaging or molecular genetics as tools to examine prisoners, but he could physically examine prisoners. And he did. He examined thousands of prisoners. And within those prisoners, Tobias, he found the mark of Cain, which I'm sure Tobias is going to talk about a little bit later, because it's got a bit of a religious overtone. What did he see? He saw this. A single palmar crease. Most of us have two palmar creases like so. But Lombroso argued, okay, you all do it. You know, some of you don't. Why don't you all do it? Take your hand like that. Flex it towards you like so. What do you see in that palm? Do you see the normal two palmar creases not connected, or the single palmar crease? Lombroso would say the mark of Cain. There are others. He also found that criminals had a big gap between the first and second toe. Now, don't take your shoes off. Do that a little bit later. I mean, it's laughable. It's ludicrous. Or is it? We now know that these are minor physical anomalies. Here are a number of them here. Let me try and describe these. These minor physical anomalies indicate disruption to fetal development at the second or third gestation of pregnancy. Let me explain that. Let's take low-seated ears. During gestation, the ears are somewhat lower on the head. During fetal development, those ears migrate up into their normal positions. If there's disruption to fetal development, for whatever reason, ears remain low. And these are other indicators here. What researchers have documented, in fact, all of these starting from a pivotal paper in Science by Halverston, antisocial children have more of these minor physical anomalies. Now, it's an indirect indicator of brain dysfunction, but it's an indication that perhaps something, even before the child is born, is marking out that that child may be more likely to become criminal and antisocial. I want to highlight the research, not of myself, but of Richard Neugebauer. Fascinating research. What else, before the child is born, could give rise to violence later in life? Poor nutrition. If the pregnant mom has poor nutrition, her offspring are more likely to become criminal. This is the Dutch famine study. End of World War II. Germany was pulling out of the Netherlands. The people in the Netherlands had poor nutrition. Some moms were pregnant during that time. What he documented is that if the mother had poor nutrition during pregnancy, then compared to a control group who had normal nutrition, the moms with poor nutrition were 2.5 times more likely to have an offspring, a son, who had antisocial personality disorder, meaning lifelong criminal offending. So again, even before the child is born, we have a factor, poor nutrition, which can negatively impact the fetal developing brain, which can raise the odds of later criminal offending. So what else can raise the odds of crime even before the child is born? Well, Van Gogh's portrait of a skull with a smoking cigarette, we've always known that smoking is bad for your health. But it's more than that. If the mother smokes during pregnancy, the offspring are more likely to be criminal and violent. How do we know that? Patricia Brennan, Emory University, 4,000 males. It's a birth cohort. In other words, babies. And this is the outcome in those 4,000. What percent of them have violence at age 34? It's broken down into several groups. This group, the mother did not smoke cigarettes during pregnancy. This group, the mum smoked 1 or 2 cigarettes, 3 to 10, or more than a pack of cigarettes a day. And you can see it. The more the mum smokes, the higher the rate of violence 34 years later. That's controlling for other social background factors. Nicotine exposure shuts off oxygen to the fetus. That damages the brain. And that's why we think it raises the odds of violence, again, controlling for background social factors. So that's another factor before the child is born that raises the odds of violence and crime. So what else can do it? Well, how about a mum taking a drink or two during pregnancy? You're probably familiar with fetal alcohol syndrome. This is the baby with fetal alcohol syndrome. You can see the physical craniofacial abnormalities that mark out a baby with fetal alcohol syndrome. A wide gap between the eyes, lack of development of the bridge of the nose, low-seated ears. This is the philtrum here, the philtrum, lack of development of the philtrum. So, alcohol exposure during fetal development physically affects the baby, but more than that, again, I'll highlight the work of Struysgard. She got 473 of these babies together and followed them up over time to see, well, what was the outcome? These are the base rates of delinquency, police contacts, and arrests in babies with fetal alcohol syndrome. Those are high base rates, aren't they? Those are high base rates. You're nodding. You agree with me. Thank you. Thank you. You'll be a scientist one day. I'd like to do a Q&A with you about what you're doing here, definitely what you're doing here right now, but we'll come to that later. But, so what's happening here? Well, I mean, there's lots of reasons why a mum who drinks during pregnancy may have a kid who's more likely to be criminal and violent. But one reason is that alcohol negatively affects the brain when you're exposed to it in utero. So let me illustrate that. This is the brain of a baby that died of 6 weeks of age for reasons other than fetal alcohol syndrome. This is the brain of a baby that died of fetal alcohol syndrome. And you can see there the ravages that alcohol does to the brain of a young baby. So no wonder that they become delinquent and they get arrested later in life. Now I want to turn from the science to ask you a social question. I want you to have a look at that baby. Did that baby have a mum who took alcohol during pregnancy? Yes, it did. You can see it in its face. Is that baby much more likely to commit crime and violence? Yes, it is. We know that from the science. Will we hold that baby responsible for its criminal acts? Of course we will. Was that baby responsible for its mother taking alcohol during pregnancy? No, it wasn't. So my question to you is that justice? Is that justice for that innocent baby? I want to come back to that question towards the end of the lecture. What I want to do now is turn to the question, the scientific question of which specific brain mechanisms may be impaired in a way to raise the odds of crime and violence. I'll only talk about two, the very frontal region of the brain and an emotional area called the amygdala. First of all, the prefrontal cortex, the very front part of your brain. We know that that's involved in part because of brain imaging research, where we brain scan people. So to give you just one example, this is a study where we took 41 murderers, matched them to 41 controls. This is the brain scan of, for example, a normal individual in the study. You're looking down on the brain, bird's eye view. Warm colors, red and yellow, indicate good brain functioning. The cool colors, blue and green, indicate poor brain functioning. This is the prefrontal cortex. It's working well in normal people. The key finding from the study is that as a group, the murderers had poorer functioning in the very frontal region of the brain. Okay, that's the finding. Why is that? Why does poor functioning in the frontal region of the brain predispose to crime and violence? Well, if we're slicing through the brain this way, it's especially the underneath region of the prefrontal cortex that we find to be impaired in offenders, especially an area called the orbitofrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain that sits right above your eyes and lies behind your forehead. Remember that, because I'm going to come back to that area at the end of the talk. Orbitofrontal cortex. What does this part of the brain do in us, normal people? Well, it's involved in making good decisions. It's involved in regulating emotions. It's involved in controlling impulsive behavior. It's involved in having good insight. It's involved in learning from experience. What we know is that criminal offenders make bad decisions. They don't regulate their emotions. They've got poor impulse control, and so on. So that's why poor functioning of this part of the brain may predispose or raise the odds that somebody will become a criminal offender. Now, one swallow does not make a summer. One study does not tell everything. What my graduate student did is pull together 43 studies which had done brain imaging on antisocial criminal offenders, comparing antisocials with normal controls and saying, well, is there a difference in frontal lobe function or structure? And averaging across those studies, there is a significant effect size. I know this is technical, an effect size. That means the strength of the relationship between the frontal lobe dysfunction and antisocial behavior. The effect size is 0.6. And you can ask me, well, Dr. Raine, what does 0.6 mean? And that's a good question. Let me try and describe that to you. So we've been talking about, well, let's talk about this, aspirin. So I've got a family history of heart disease. So I take a baby aspirin every day under the idea I'm going to reduce my chances of death from cardiovascular disease. How strong is the relationship between taking this aspirin and stopping death from cardiovascular disease? The effect size is 0.04. It's very small. It affects my behavior every day. We've talked about smoking as a killer, right? Smoking causes lung cancer, right? How strong is that relationship? It's 0.16. The link between smoking and lung cancer, the strength of that relationship is 0.16. Okay, so I know quite a bunch of you here, half, may be undergraduates. How do we select you? SAT scores. How well do SAT scores predict future performance, grade point average? The effect size is 0.4. To get to an effect size of 0.6, you need to take attention deficit disordered kids, give them an attention task, and show, guess what, that their attention is poorer than normal controls. That's when you get to the strength of the relationship that we find between poor frontal lobe functioning and antisocial behavior. My key point is that it's not a trivial relationship, and it replicates. There is strength in this association. But there's an important caveat. There's two. First of all, it's not one size fits all. Not all murderers have poor frontal lobe functioning. This is one of the murderers in our study. His name is Randy Kraft. This is his brain scan here. Look at his frontal lobe functioning. It's not low. This is an impulsive killer who killed one person, an example of a normal control. Randy was a serial killer. He killed 64 people in a 12-year period in California without being caught, or almost without being caught. In fact, you know, the only reason he was found out is he was driving late just south of LA on the freeway, and the California Highway Patrol were behind him. What did he do wrong? Poor guy, he made an illegal lane change late at night on the freeway. How many of us have done that? I mean, you know, poor guy. But the police pull him over. And, you know, actually, Randy is pretty careful. He has a can of beer. Actually, his car is here. The police are there. He gets out of his car, takes a beer can. He walks back to the police with a can of beer. Interesting. What's going on here? So they breathalyze him, and they find out that he's over the limit. So they decide they need to impound the car over there. So to save Randy some money, because he can't drive, right, because he's drunk, they see a passenger in the seat, and they think, well, the passenger can actually drive the car back. So the policeman goes to wake up the passenger. The passenger doesn't wake up. It's a dead body in the passenger seat. That's the only reason they find out that Randy was the killer. What I want to say here is that, you see, I think it's the exception that proves the rule. Here's a man who could carefully regulate, plan, and control his behavior. Killing 64 people, taking them out to drink at night, putting drugs in their drink, having sex with them, then strangling them, killing them, cleaning up the blood, and going into work next day as a computer consultant. He was a smart guy. You've got to have something good going for you to kill 64 people almost without being caught. What Randy had good going for him is good frontal lobe functioning, allowing him to plan, regulate, and control his behavior. Think of it as really just context here. Think of the frontal cortex as the guardian angel on behavior. It regulates our emotions. It regulates impulsive behavior. If the guardian angel is asleep, as it is in some murderers, then the devil can come out, and some people can get killed. So that's one brain area that we believe is important in predisposing to crime and violence, poor frontal lobe functioning. Now, we did have another individual with a brain scan here. I mean, you look at that brain scan. Try and compare that to these three. Which one, if you were sorting it, which pile would you put it in? The normal, the serial killer, or the murderer? The serial, it's got good frontal lobe functioning. Look at the thalamus, the bilateral activation of the thalamus here. You see that there. You don't see it here. But the good occipital lobe functioning, the temporal lobe functioning. What's interesting about this scan is that it's my brain scan. Now, the point is that you're not all at risk a bit later on after a drink or two going back home. No, the point is this. Imaging is not diagnostic. We can't use brain imaging to say, well, who's normal? Who's a one-off killer? Who's a serial killer? Absolutely not. But imaging is beginning to give us clues about what brain areas, when dysfunctional, could predispose, raise the odds. I'm only talking about raising the odds that somebody will become criminal and violent. Now, shift gears. I said 2 brain areas, keeping this simple. Poor frontal lobe functioning. Next brain area at the back, poor amygdala functioning. The amygdala, it's the emotional center of the brain. You've all heard about psychopaths. These are people who lack conscience. They lack remorse. They lack guilt. They just don't feel feelings like we do. Why is that? We were interested in that, and one of my other graduate students took 27 psychopaths in the community. It's a long story about how we found psychopaths in the community. But we do find them. They are out there. And to shortcut, they're at temporary employment agencies. But I don't want to disparage everyone working in temporary employment agencies. But that's where we found them. Compared them to 32 people who were not psychopathic. We measured the volume, the size of the amygdala, the emotion region of the brain, this part of the brain here. And we found an 18% volume reduction in this emotion center of the brain. So these psychopaths have a physical deficit. It's a bit like what Lombroso was talking about. You can even see the mark of Cain, a shrinkage in the emotion region of the brain. So is that why they lack conscience and they lack empathy and that they don't have the same feelings as we do? Because that emotion part of the brain is like, 3 sizes too small, Maybe, maybe not. It's a correlation. We can't put too much into it. But we can definitely say that these psychopaths who lack conscience, lack emotion, have a physical impairment in the emotion center of the brain. The blue parts indicate those areas of the amygdala which are structurally deformed in psychopaths. This part of the amygdala here is very much involved in fear. So if humans actually have damage to the amygdala, they are fearless. They lack fear. We were interested in seeing, well, how early on in life could poor amygdala functioning predispose to later crime? You see, here's the problem with brain imaging research. It's correlational. So you have these adult psychopaths, you brain scan them, and you show, okay, these psychopaths have like an impaired brain. But chicken and egg, what comes first? Does the brain impairment cause crime and psychopathy? Or does living a psychopathic way of life in some way create the brain abnormality? I mean, that could be. We know that London taxi drivers, because of their experience getting around London and navigating all the curvy streets that we have in England, they have an enlargement of the hippocampus, part of the brain that's involved in finding your way around. So the social environment can change the brain. The only way that we can see whether poor amygdala functioning predisposes to later crime is by measuring amygdala functioning early in life. Now, no study really has ever done that. But what we were able to do is measure fearfulness in 3-year-old children. So that's what I want to come on to. Children who lack fear at age 3 and what they're like. So this is a study that my other graduate student took the lead on. It was done in a country called Mauritius. Mauritius is a small tropical island in the Indian Ocean. I have to go there 2 or 3 times a year to do research, and that's the view from my hotel room. Terrible place to go. And you know, next month I have to go on my 41st trip to Mauritius. But I do it because I'm a scientist, and I say, I don't care what, I'll do it. But this is the design of the study. We have 1,800 3-year-old children from Mauritius. At age 3, we measured something called fear conditioning. We put electrodes on the fingers to measure sweat rate activity. What we're doing is basically measuring how scared they are just before they get blasted with a loud noise played over on a pair of headphones. It's a bit technical. Psychology students may be familiar with fear conditioning. Think of it as you think of a time when you wanted to do something that wasn't a right thing to do. You think about doing it, like stealing money or doing something immoral. You think hard about it, and what happens? Your heart begins to pound a bit more. You sweat a little bit more. That's anticipatory fear. That's what stops you becoming criminal. The idea is, though, if you lack anticipatory fear, if you lack fear before an aversive punishment is going to come on, if you're fearless, you're more likely to commit a criminal act because you're not frightened about the consequences of your behavior. So we can measure this biologically by measuring sweat rate on the fingers of a 3-year-old child. Now, let's take these 1,800 3-year-old kids. If we followed them up over time to age 23, we found 137 of them had a criminal record. We matched them 2 to 1 with normal controls, matching them on gender, ethnicity, and also social adversity. So, 2 groups, 1 criminal, 1 not criminal, based on records at age 23. Let's go back in time to age 3. This is the degree of fear conditioning. Poor fear conditioning, good fear conditioning. These are the 3-year-olds who do not become criminals. They have good fear conditioning at age 3. And remember, this is a measure, an indirect measure of amygdala functioning. Every neuroscientist would probably say that. The green bars are those 3-year-old tots who grow up to become criminal offenders. Poor fear conditioning, poor amygdala functioning. So we think the poor amygdala functioning comes before the development of crime at age 23. It's called a longitudinal study. So we do think something is going wrong with the brain, especially the amygdala, early on in life, raising the odds that somebody will become criminal. The idea is if you lack fear, you are more likely to become criminal because you're not concerned, you're not frightened about the punishments that could await you if you're caught. Now, when my graduate student published this research in the American Journal of Psychiatry, they ran an editorial on it, meaning a critique, a criticism. Written by a scientist called Philippe Sturzer, it was called Born to be Criminal? What are we making of these early biological risk factors for crime? And it was critical, and it said, whoa, hands off. If you're not very cautious, these biological markers could be misused to stigmatize young kids, as a threat to society. That would be wrong. And it would be wrong, wouldn't it? It would. But Sturzer goes on to say, but this biological knowledge is giving us a great chance to understand what causes crime. His last sentence reads thus: so we should, Tobias, we should use this knowledge to benefit kids at greatest risk for a criminal career and develop interventions to reduce crime and violence. Well, my question to you is that a bridge too far to screen and intervene at an early age with young kids before they've done any crime? I don't know. I think that could be a little bit far to go. Or is it the right way to go? Because we need to do more to help these kids who are at risk for crime. You can look at it from two different perspectives. If you watch movies, remember that movie, Tom Cruise, Minority Report? There you go, nodding your head. So you can resonate with this. Maybe we should screen and intervene early on to stop it before it starts. That's the logic that Sturzer is arguing for. My question to you is, but is that an invasion of freedom in society? The idea of screening and intervening early on in life. So that's an ethical question that we can discuss a little bit later. I want to stick with the amygdala because it's very important in making moral decisions. How do we know that? It's because we brain scan people just like you, who I'm assuming are pretty normal and non-criminal. I'm assuming that. And what we do in a brain scanner, we give you moral dilemmas. So what type of things do we do? Well, I'll give you an example of that. And by the way, what happens during these moral dilemmas is that the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain, lights up. Imagine you're in the scanner, okay? So this is the dilemma. You've got this runaway trolley that's going to run forward and kill these 5 people. You're standing on a footbridge watching this. Standing next to you is a large gentleman. Okay? You're in the scanner. You're given this dilemma. The only way, I repeat, the only way that you can save these 5 men is push the big guy off the bridge. I know, it's sad. Okay, question in the scanner, would you do it? Would you push him off? I want you to think about this right now. Don't say anything, think. What would you do? I saw you. But come on, 5-1. You should do it. Are you going to are you going to let 5 innocent men die that you could have saved? Come on. 5-1, utilitarian moral decision making. Are you going to watch those 5 men die? Lives you could have saved? Come on. Or, thou shalt not kill. I think that's wrong, by the way, from the Bible, but you know what I mean? It's not good to kill. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a dilemma. I'm not interested, frankly, in how you decide it. I'm interested in how you feel, because we know that when people do this dilemma, the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain, lights up. But what my graduate student, Andrea Glenn, did is put people in the scanner who range in the degree of psychopathy, how psychopathic they are. She's got 17 people. Each person is a red dot. On this axis, you've got degree of amygdala activation, high amygdala, low amygdala functioning. Low psychopathy, high psychopathy. The higher the psychopathy, the lower the amygdala functioning. Bottom line here is that when psychopaths make moral decisions, their amygdala is not firing. The emotional engine that drives moral behavior is burnt out, you see? So what this gets me thinking, is this. I mean, there's a heaven and hell in all of us. Come on, there is. We've all broken the rules at one point in time. And in the law, the question is, do we know what we're doing? It's based on cognition. Well, criminals know right from wrong. I think we cannot deny that. But my question is, do they have the feeling, the emotional feeling of what is right and wrong? Because that last experiment documented that psychopathic individuals don't have the feeling for what is wrong. You know, when faced with a moral dilemma or a moral decision, the amygdala is not firing. And I would argue that it's the feeling of what is right and wrong that drives moral behavior in part, not just the knowledge. And if that emotional engine that drives moral behavior is burnt out in psychopaths, then how moral is it of us to punish psychopaths as harshly as we do? Who's the real sinner here, is my question. Now I want to turn to legal implications. Prevention, very difficult issue here. I've been arguing bad brain, bad behavior. So you could say, so what are you going to do about it? That's a hard nut to crack. So historically, let me turn to Marie Antoinette. Remember the story when the French peasants were revolting and baying for her blood? Marie Antoinette is reputed to have said, well, if they have no bread, then let them eat cake. And I think she may have been on the right mark there, that better nutrition for these poor peasants may reduce their violent, revolting behavior. And it's not just food for thought, it's increasingly food for court as magistrates begin to become more interested in the link between diet and crime. Why would they be interested in that? Well, research knowledge. I want to highlight some research by Joe Hibbelin at the National Institute of Alcoholism. Let me describe the graph. On this axis, you have homicide rates in countries per 100,000. Low homicide, high homicide. On the x-axis here, you have seafood consumption per person, per pounds per year. Low, high. 26 countries, the red squares. There's a relationship, a correlation between seafood consumption and homicide. The more the seafood consumption, the lower the homicide rates. So, I mean, look, take Japan. They eat their whole body weight in fish every year, more than 140 pounds. Low homicide rates. Eastern European countries, low fish consumption, high homicide rates. By the way, this is data from 2001. When I presented this to criminologists, they said, wait, United States aren't on there. So they went and found the data. Yeah, United States are not on there. Where were United States? Right there, at that point in time. Right on the line. Now, it's just a correlation. Correlation is not causation. To get causation, you need to manipulate one variable, in this case, fish consumption, and show a difference in behavior later, a randomized controlled trial. So that's something we did in Mauritius. We gave some kids more omega-3. That's what's contained in fish, which is critical for brain structure and brain function. Omega-3, a long-chain fatty acid. Makes up 35% of the cell membrane, for example. So, randomized controlled trial, 200 kids. 100 kids of the kids get a fruit juice drink containing omega-3. The other group, without them knowing it, get the same juice drink, but it doesn't contain omega-3. Both groups think they're in a treatment study. They don't know what group they're in. It's a double-blind study. We measure antisocial behavior at baseline. The two groups don't differ. This is antisocial behavior scores. Green line, omega-3, red line, the control group. Both groups improve in the treatment. It's called a placebo effect. If you're in a treatment study, everyone tends to improve because they think they're in a treatment study, they think they should get better, and they do. But the drink stops at 6 months. They take the drink for 6 months. After that, nothing. So the control group, they go back to where they came from pretty well, whereas the omega-3 group continue to go down. A significant group effect. And that's the effect size. And now, you're all scientists now, you know that an effect size of 0.35 is nothing to be sneezed at. It's not everything, But could it be that something as simple as better nutrition, like omega-3, something to improve the brain, can reduce antisocial behavior in young kids, the future generation, who will become the next violent offenders in 10 years' time? So we can talk more about that, but that's treatment. How about prediction? Again, I'm not going to talk a lot about prediction. We've talked, however, about the amygdala. Remember, the emotion region of the brain. Dustin Pardini is the lead researcher on this. I'm a co-author. Dustin Pardini brain scanned males in the community. He measured the size of the amygdala, and he broke the group down into those with low amygdala volumes and high amygdala volumes. These are just men in the community. He then followed them up for 3 years to find out which ones created or committed a violent criminal act. So this is where the amygdala is. It's deep in the brain. This group are those with low amygdala volumes. This group are those with high amygdala volumes. This is the percentage who commit a violent criminal act 3 years later. 57% in the low amygdala volume versus 18% in the high amygdala volume. Putting it very simply, if you've got low amygdala volumes, if you've got blunted emotional functions, you are 3 times more likely to commit violence in the next 3 to 4 years. That's prediction over and above prior history of aggression, violence, and psychopathic behavior. These are factors that we usually use to predict future aggression and violence. The question is this: if biology, brain imaging, and let's say genetics, other biological factors, can help us better predict who is a future risk in society, are we prepared to go that way? I would say, and let me lay my cards out, I would say yes, because every single day, judges and probation officers need to make decisions on who to let out of prison early because they're not dangerous, and who to keep in prison because they are dangerous. And if brain imaging and other biological measures gives us better prediction, then why not use it? But it can get a bit scary, because maybe in the future we can start genotyping all of you here, brain scanning all of you here. You're nodding your head. You can read my mind. And we lock those up with all the biological markers checked, and the social markers, and the family markers. The future violent offenders, we lock you up to protect society. Ostensibly a good thing to do, but it goes back to Tom Cruise and the Minority Report. There's something wrong with that. So I think there's a tension here between practice, acting for betterment in society, and making society worse. Lastly, and I'm finishing up about now, punishment. What if you buy my argument? My argument is, as a theological context here, the seeds of sin are sown early in life. And for some people, free will is not as free as it is for the rest of us. Think of those babies with alcohol exposure, smoking, poor nutrition, right? What if they have all the boxes checked for reasons beyond their control? Are we going to punish them? What if there's a brain basis beyond their control for their criminal behavior? Would we punish them as much as we are doing now? I want to try and illustrate that with a case example. His name is Michael. This is Michael here. I'll tell you a bit about Michael. He's 40 years old. He's in his second marriage. It's a stable marriage. He used to be a correctional officer, but he got his master's, and he became a school teacher. Okay? So he has a wife, and he has a stepdaughter. She's about 12 years old. He's got no prior psychiatric history. He's got no history of sexually deviant behavior. But then Michael's behavior began to change. I want to show you just a 3-minute video of the change that occurred in Michael. You'll hear from Michael. You'll hear from his wife. You'll hear from his stepdaughter. You'll hear about the change. And I'm then, after the video, going to tell you what brought about this change. And then we're going to discuss a little bit more Michael's case.
I didn't see any more, didn't hear of any more, had no suspicions of any until February 14, which is Valentine's Day of 2000. And I went to put a card, a Valentine's Day card, in his, the carrier that he took to work with him every day. And in there I saw that there was pornography. And I was horrified and so scared because you can't take porn to school. You just can't do that. You risk everything.
Michael was starting to act out of character in other, more frightening ways.
It seemed as though he was just always on edge, always angry. You know, he was taking pills every day because he was having these massive headaches. I mean, can remember this horrible argument we had on Thanksgiving Day where he grabbed my hair and actually pulled out, you know, some of my hair. And it was at that point I called a counselor and said, you know, we need some help.
In the months which followed, the stepfather, husband, and high school teacher began to lead a double life.
A ball rolling downhill. It just gained speed. Pornography and strip clubs accelerated and expanded to massage parlors. But all of this is a desire towards grown women.
And then in May, I found a magazine called Barely Legal, which showed young girls who supposedly are legal, but frankly look like they're 13, 14 years old. And I was absolutely furious. I took Christina, she and I went to my mother's to stay with her for a couple of weeks while I thought about what to do. Just sort of like this kind of look of, what?
Anne's daughter Christina was 12 years old when she too started to notice changes in Michael's behavior.
Like, I've always been really, really close to my parents. They would lay down with me at night before I would go to sleep and maybe like sing me a lullaby or something like that. And it went on until I was way old. I remember like he would lay down with me and then that's when it started. It would always happen at night.
My wife started a nighttime class 2 days a week. She didn't get home until 10 o'clock at night. But when my stepdaughter laid down with me in her pajamas, I began to, not always, but sometimes, be a little more intimate with her than I should. And somewhere deep, deep, deep in the back of my head, there was a little voice saying, you shouldn't do this. But there was a much larger voice saying, what the heck, why not?
So Michael was found guilty of child molestation, and he was sentenced to either treatment program or he had to go to prison. And Michael, of course, decided to go to the treatment program. And there he began to sexually proposition the other females in the program, so he was thrown out. So he had to go to prison. The night before he was due to go to prison, he developed a really terrible headache. So he went to ER complaining of the headache, complaining he was suicidal, which you would be if you were about to go to prison. You'd say, got a bad headache, I'm suicidal. They admitted him onto the psychiatric ward as a pedophile. There he began to again sexually proposition the females on the ward. And then he wet his trousers and showed no emotion at all about it. No shame, no remorse, no uncomfortableness, as we would if we peed in our pants. So an astute neurologist had him brain scanned. And this is what they found. Remember the orbital frontal cortex that I talked about at the very beginning? That's this part here. There was a tumor growing from the base of the orbital frontal cortex compressing his prefrontal cortex. The neurosurgeons took out the brain tumor, and it was a miraculous change. Michael was transformed. The emotions came back. He began to feel very guilty about what had happened, remorseful. They sent him back to the treatment program. This time he successfully completed it because all those sexual feelings were gone. And he went to live back with his wife and his stepdaughter to live happily ever after. Now, it's only a case study, let's be careful, but it's an interesting shift, isn't it? From normality to brain tumor to pedophilic interests to resection of the brain tumor for the pendulum to swing all the way back to normality again. It's as close as you can get to cause and effect. And it should have been happily ever after for Michael. And for 6 months it was. But then the headaches came back. And the pedophilic interests came back. And his wife found child pornography on his computer. She found it, she reported it, she divorced him, never to live with him again. She's not going to risk her stepdaughter with this man again. They brain scanned Michael for a second time and found the tumor had grown back. They took out the tumor for the second time, and for 6 years since then, Michael has been quite normal. I repeat again, it's only a case study. We can't read too much into this data. But it's an interesting case study documenting that brain abnormalities could predispose, certainly, to antisocial behavior, including pedophilia. Now, is Michael responsible? You are the jury. You're on the jury. You're going to make a snap decision. We're going to have a show of hands here. And, you know, you're not neurosurgeons, you're not radiologists, but you're jury members. You could be. Given this case, given this evidence, would you find Michael responsible for his pedophilia? If you would find Michael responsible, would you raise your hand, please? Thank you. Hands down. Put up your hand if you would not find Michael responsible. Would not find Michael responsible. Hands down. Thank you very much. 2/3 of you, about, I think, would not find Michael responsible. About 1/3 would. What does the law say? The law says Michael is responsible, no question about it. Why? He has something called rational capacity. What's rational capacity? It's two simple things in the law. First, do you know what you're doing? Second, do you know that what you were doing was wrong? Michael has rational capacity. Remember at the end of the video, Michael said, there was a little voice in the back of my head that said, you shouldn't do this. But there was a much bigger voice at the front saying, what the heck, why not? Michael knew what he was doing. He knew that what he was doing was wrong. Michael is responsible. And Michael even says, look, I did it. I'm responsible. I'm the one to blame. But is it justice to blame Michael? That's my question. And Michael says, now, would you hold me as accountable as somebody who did the same thing but didn't have the brain tumor? Michael says, I don't think so. And I would agree with Michael. So part of my sense is, you know, the brain tumor resulted in a lack of moral sense, a lack of an emotional sense of right and wrong. And I would think that maybe the law in the future should take in emotions into account alongside knowledge and cognition in weighing responsibility and culpability. I want to turn to the very end here because I'm out of time. As we begin to build knowledge on the causes of crime, will our perspectives on punishment change? Yes, a recent paper says they will. Free will, is it as free as we think, or is it just a puppet on a string? Is it just an illusion? And what implication does that have for our sense of punishment? A new study out here says that the more we learn about how the brain affects behavior, the less retributivist we are as a group, as people. Meaning that, you know, in a control group, if a man killed someone, how many years in prison would they give? On average, they'll say 10 years. But if you'd done a course in cognitive science, for example, learning about the brain basis to behavior, just that experience, for example, would reduce your punishment to 5 years. So the neuroscience knowledge on the causes of crime is changing our sense of retribution. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, pound of flesh. My question to you is, let's assume that that's the case. Is that the right way for society to go? Because look, isn't all behavior got a cause? Just because we find the brain basis to behavior, should that excuse it? I mean, come on. Wouldn't that mean none of us are responsible? Wouldn't that result in Armageddon, a lawless society? Now, I don't think, part of me thinks we can't have that. We have to be practical. We have to be sensible. We need to give signals out there that you can't get away with committing crime. You're going to be punished. The other side of me is the bleeding heart for criminals and for young babies of the type that I showed you. And part of me thinks we're not all equal, as the law argues. We're not all equal. The law needs to wake up to that. There's differences. And for some people, the dice are loaded early in life. And for some, free will is just not as free will as we would like to think. I want to quickly summarize what I've been saying. I've been talking about the early risk factors that raise the odds that somebody will be criminal. So who is to blame? Brain mechanisms, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Maybe there's an early neurodevelopmental abnormality underlying crime and violence. And actually, does that mean we medicalize crime? Would crime and violence in the future become a medical disorder, which we sort of go easier on and give an excuse to? And lastly, what are the implications? Well, can we intervene? Can we change biology to change the brain basis to crime? Can we use biology to better predict who amongst us is more likely to commit crime and violence? Stop the rot before it starts. And lastly, as Portia said in The Merchant of Venice, should mercy season justice? The more we understand the causes of behavior, should that lead us as a society, as a community, to a more understanding sense of people who commit crime and showing a little bit more compassion and understanding than we currently do at the moment. But having said all of that, next online here we have Tobias Winright, who is going to is he going to dissect the biological roots of crime? Is he going to dissolve the biological roots of crime? Come on, Tobias, let's hear the other perspective.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I think you probably have many questions for Adrian, so I'm going to try to keep this very brief. It's good to be here. Why am I here? I don't have anything like Adrian did with the palms, so everybody look at their palms. Maybe invite me back on Palm Sunday. I don't know. I am a Catholic theologian. I am an ethicist. I've written mostly about violence-related issues, such as war and peace, but also including criminal justice, as was said by Rachel early on. I used to be a correctional officer and a reserve police officer. I also have family members in law enforcement, including my mom. You may have seen her on A&E or History Channel or Discovery Channel. She has a different last name, though. But she was a homicide detective for the same department where I worked in Florida. And she specialized in serial murder cases and cold cases. I have spent time with violent criminals. I've got some scars from violent criminals. I also have some scars from acne and Lombroso, and others of his tradition would say that it could be a marker, right? I'll come back to that. I used to be a youth minister, and I had this visit with, I remember I visited a family who had their son murdered, while at the same time I was visiting another youth in the church who was accused of murder. Somehow I had to be there for both. So when I was invited to offer a brief theological, this sounds weird to me, a brief theological response to Dr. Raine and his book, The Anatomy of Violence, how could I refuse? Even more so was this the case given that 28 months ago, that's a brain scan of my head. There's another. There's another. Why did I have these scans? I fell in a hotel on a trip and bashed my head on the sink in the bathroom. Fractured my skull from here to here. Bleeding, subdural hemorrhage right down the middle. I'm still recovering. There's been a few times when I've snapped and my wife looked at me and said, "You are not yourself." So this book hits close to home in places. I read with enthusiasm all 373 pages. You thought this was fascinating? There's so much more. I highly recommend it. It's an interesting read, more case studies, research, personal anecdotes. Raine is an engaging, talented, and witty writer. He writes like he presents, actually, without the accent, though. Of course, much of it's not appropriate bedtime reading, I must warn you. So my remarks are going to be divided into two. First, I'm going to highlight some things that actually I think are somewhat consonant with Catholic theology and ethics in his work. And then I'm going to highlight, secondly, a few areas or points that I think may be possibly problematic from the standpoint of Catholic and Christian theology and ethics. So first, the promising stuff. Peace be with you. Oh, almost second nature for some of you. That's good, that's good. Raine and the Catholic Christian tradition, and he was brought up Catholic, so some of it stuck. Both view violence as a problem. Raine sees violence as analogous to cancer, and both are, in his view, healthcare problems that need to be addressed. Both need a cure. Preventative medicine is lifted up by Raine as an intelligent and effective way for addressing these diseases. Raine says in the book, "I do believe that in tomorrow's world we can rise above our feelings of retribution, reach out for rehabilitation, and engage in a more human discourse on the causes of violence. After all, while we may disagree on the finer points, I believe we can all agree on our priority of preventing future violence." As the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think that to a great extent, Catholic theology and ethics shares this view. Violence is a problem. We are all called to be peacemakers. We are made in the image of God, made for peace and for love. Pope Benedict said that we are actually made for gift to one another. In the Bible, there's an emphasis on shalom, harmony. That's God's original intent for creation, and that's the goal when we'll have the lamb lay down with the lion. I'm not lying to you either, all right? Just making sure you're still awake and listening. John Milbank, a theologian in England, refers to this as an ontology of peace. Peace is the goal or end of creation and human existence. And Catholics and other Christians have called for just peacemaking practices with regard to mitigating the causes that give rise to war, civil war, terrorism. We're called to be proactive rather than reactive when it comes to violence questions. There's something now called responsibility to protect. That's the new name for humanitarian intervention, where we intervene in advance proactively to try to prevent the rise of violence. I used to be in policing. The founder of policing was a guy in 1829 in London named Robert Peel. He was all about community policing, policing that was proactive rather than reactive, that would try to address the social, not the biological, but the social causes that would give rise to violence. So, Raine, in his text, shares this goal. How can we prevent violence? How can we reduce its likelihood? That's commendable. I think any Catholic, any Christian, would give that a thumbs up. We may still differ, however, on some of the hows. To do that. Better diet and nutrition, no problem. Scanning everyone, putting some in a facility, maybe that's a bit too far. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, during the discussion. Raine, secondly, is also very concerned about the retributive character, I'll just put in there, American society and criminal justice. I don't know if you noticed or not, Pope Francis just recently spoke about this. And he referred to really hyper-retributive attitudes in society in connection with not only death penalty, but also life imprisonment. On page 336, Adrian, you refer to how we've given up on the lifers. Pope Francis recently said something almost verbatim the same. How can we provide a life for lifers? In the Bible, we used to refer to them as cities of refuge, cities of sanctuary. And prisons used to be a place for rehabilitation and penitentiary penitence. We've gotten far from that. I used to be a corrections officer. Now it's more of a warehousing officer and a punishment type of thing. So there, I think we also connect. And I think the Catholic Church is doing a much better job lately. We still teach that punishment of criminals is legitimate and justified and necessary, but we emphasize more rehabilitation, which includes also restitution. But the Catholic model of justice and punishment now is more about restorative justice. That's the overarching frame, than only retributive justice. A lot of people in the pews might not be aware of that in a society such as this, but that is indeed where Catholic teaching has been for quite a while now, as seen in the increasing opposition, for example, to capital punishment. So yes, mercy should season justice. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the lex talionis, which appears only 3 times in the Old Testament. It also appears in the Code of Hammurabi. That eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, Jesus said something about that too in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said of old, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I tell you. So mercy is supposed to season that justice. Now, let me say a few problematic things. There's a number of times Adrian uses the language you noticed. Angel, devil, sin, mark of Cain. These terms come from our tradition, our scriptures, and I'm sorry, but some of your references are a little bit dated or caricatured. On the last page of his book, he writes that he hopes readers will not turn a blind eye to science, continuing to believe that a biological basis to violence does not exist. And he says, quote, like an ostrich evading the hunter, you may decide to bury your head in the sand. So don't bury your head in the sand. And right after that, he quotes Oliver Cromwell, a former Catholic, quoting Oliver Cromwell, who destroyed all these beautiful Catholic churches in Ireland. But Cromwell said to the Church of Scotland concerning its intended alliance with King Charles II, I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible that you might be mistaken. So those who want to put their head in the sand, not listen to the science, don't be an ostrich, put your head in the sand. But, the ostrich is not a symbol of the church. The dove is. The Holy Spirit. and peace. The Holy Spirit that moves and leads us in creative new ways to learn, to grow. We're not all medievalists anymore. We're not all fundamentalists either. We Catholics, Pope Francis just recently said the same thing Pope Benedict XVI said, same thing John Paul II said. Evolution, we get it. Faith and reason that St. Albert the Great embodied and practiced. That's where we're at now. The Vatican even has an observatory where they have these meetings with physicists, and they're already talking about, will we baptize intelligent extraterrestrial life? And one official, as you know, maybe you've seen the news, one prominent person said yes. I mean, we're thinking about stuff like that. Not all Christians are, not all fundamentalists are for sure, but we Catholics are. So we should be trying to learn from you. And I think we do have things to learn from him. But that doesn't mean we just swallow it all, hook, line, and sinker, and you don't want us to. You want us to engage and ask and probe and try to, the other thing, arrive at some sort of better understanding together. We shouldn't be afraid of that. We have been at times in the past. Hopefully we don't see him as another Galileo, right? Well, maybe you want to be. I don't know. All right. I got my eyes on you. Yeah. So then theological anthropology, just our view of human nature. There are different Christian accounts of human nature. Reinhold Niebuhr, a prominent Protestant theologian and ethicist from the mid-20th century, he said that good and evil are always mixed in all of us. A little devil, a little angel in all of us. He said, here's a line, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's inclination, not just capacity, but inclination for injustice makes democracy necessary. Well, that's a kind of a little bit more pessimistic view of human nature there. We have possibilities, capacity for justice and good things, but we have an inclination towards sin and evil. The Catholic view, well, you know, that even varies in Catholic tradition, but for the most part, most of us are Thomists now rather than Augustinians, although Augustine's making a comeback. We have a little bit more positive view of human nature, and it involves will. It involves intellect. It also, there's a lot of work in theology lately about the role of the passions and the emotions. So I think a Catholic perspective would actually, going back to where we might have some point of contact, would maybe support what you suggest about criminal justice system taking into account feelings and not just intellect with regard to cases such as the one you highlighted. What about free will, though? I mean, do we Christians really believe in absolute free will? I mean, Augustine got us rolling with this whole thing about original sin. Augustine wrote about how, well, one treatise is called The Bondage of the Will. In moral theology, Christian ethics, I usually talk about how, in my classes, it's a human endeavor. We don't usually talk about morality and ethics with regard to other animals, although we may have to update that. You know, we're learning so much more. But I tell my students, I grew up in Florida. I used to sit there and watch the sunset over the water on the Gulf of Mexico. And I'd see the dolphins out there swimming, probably seeing a lot of the same things I could see. And I'd be praying. I'd be thinking about what am I supposed to do with my life? Why don't any girls like me? All that kind of stuff, you know, all these existential questions. Dolphins are very intelligent. I don't know if any of them were asking such questions like, what is the purpose of my life? Right? Bad. I used to be in crime and punishment. Still doing that, right? I don't know about that, but free will, most of us, there is this element of choice, responsibility, accountability, but I think in their tradition there has been room for, like, there's a continuum of this. At one point you refer to it as a totem pole, and some persons with really seriously damaged brains, you know, they're at the bottom of the totem pole. And I like that image, I think. I don't think that any of us have ever taught that you're totally free I think we do agree that, well, with regard to conscience, sometimes people do something that's regarded as objectively wrong and immoral, but subjectively there are mitigating factors. In the Catholic tradition, we have taken that into account with regard to penance, with regard to things like that. So I think there's room for a conversation there. And I think one thing on Mark of Cain, and I'm going to stop so we can have discussion. You refer to it constantly as a curse. It actually was a sign of protection. Pope John Paul II referred to it in his Gospel of Life encyclical, 1995. Cain was the first murderer. He was not executed. He was sent into exile. And he said, "Oh, God forbid, no! People are going to find me and kill me out there. I'll be, And God said, "No. I put my mark on you to protect you. No one will harm you." So I think that's, and it's not you. I know others have used that mark of Cain as a negative thing. But, I think, again, that shows how mercy tempers and seasons this justice thing. So thank you very much. I hope maybe something there stimulates further questions.
Thank you again, Dr. Raine and Dr. Winright. We truly have deepened and furthered the conversation between science and religion. We have some time for Q&A and hope you are letting your questions simmer. One quick note, too, for people that may leave, we do have Raine's books for sale, and he's offered to sign them. So if the talk intrigued you, please purchase one, and there's time for signatures. Since we do have a large group, we're going to try and organize the Q&A. We'll start with this side of the room. I have a microphone. My colleague Claire has one in the middle. So after we get a question here, we'll go to the middle. And then another colleague, Hema, has a microphone on the far side of the room. So we have a lot of us, so we'd like to keep it to one question, and then our respondents will respond. So maybe we'll start over here and let your questions simmer.
Thank you. Very, very stimulating presentations, both of you, and I thank you for that. In your book, Dr. Raine, you mention a definition for conscience as the capacity to be fearful of punishment. And as a mother and as a teacher, I know that. But I wonder why you have nothing in that definition that would talk about the motivation toward the positive, which, as Kohlberg said, you start in the raw, basic infancy with a fear of this or that that's going to be harmful to you, but you progress from that to a desire to please, and then for other more advanced motivations. So I'm just wondering if there is a reason that you have limited that definition.
It's an excellent question, and the reason, I fully understand it, and the reason is that there's basically very little research on the positive side there. So a lot of researchers on crime and violence are focusing on deficits, bad things, negative things. There is, however, a silver lining to this cloud. There's a sort of new arena in psychology called positive psychology. And it's a relatively recent movement spearheaded by Martin Seligman, actually at my institution in one of my departments. And I'm hoping that in the next 2 decades, there'll be a lot more focus on what are the factors that take some people out of the gutter. These are people who should, by all intents and purposes, become a criminal offender, and yet they don't. I think it's a fascinating question. What's protecting them from a life of crime? That's what you're asking, and it's a greatly under-researched question. And I think scholars like me and others like us need to focus on that a lot more, because it'll bring us on the road to better prevention and intervention programs.
May I say something just real quickly on that? On conscience, that's something I wanted to say more about, but for the sake of time, I did not. But we Catholics, we see conscience more as a verb rather than as a noun. It's a process. I mean, the tradition says there's antecedent conscience, which is a capacity that we're all born with, but it must be informed and shaped And that's conscience's process, and then you come to conscience where you make a judgment. And it kind of parallels with the Kohlberg stuff, too, that ultimately we want to get to a point. I mean, look at Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Franz Jägerstätter. These were people of conscience that stood up for the right thing regardless of the consequences, regardless of the fear. I mean, so that went the other way with them.
You're talking about brave people with courage and conviction. And that's what we need to understand and learn a lot more about.
This is more of a comment than a question, but what I missed in both discussions were the victims. I know we have to temper mercy with justice and justice with mercy, but neither of you, from what I could tell, discussed the victims of crimes. Ask any of the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. You think they'd want to hear some of this stuff?
Right, so I'll stand up for the victims of crime. I had my throat cut in Turkey, and I sort of start the anatomy of violence that way. And I'm not proud of this, but I'm death eligible, meaning that if I was picked on a jury in a death penalty case, I wouldn't be turned away because I'm that much against the death penalty. What that episode did in my life as a victim is turn me from somebody who would never dream of condoning the death penalty to someone who felt absolutely outraged by the violation on my life. There was a court case. The person was found. They were brought to court. I gave my testimony. He gave his. All I knew is that he was getting a prison sentence. I didn't want that. I wanted his throat cut. And I still have those feelings. Again, I'm not proud of those feelings, but part of me that holds back from the issue of mercy seasoning justice is my own personal experience, where at the very least I can connect with the victims of crime. And you brought up the Holocaust, the 6 million Jewish people and the 60 million, I think, who died in World War II. We've got victims here. What about them? Now, I think the counterpoint to what I'm saying is what Tobias brought up. He brought up this concept called restorative justice. I never had that. So in restorative justice, I would be brought together with the guy who cut my throat, and I'd give him a right what for about how I feel, and he would maybe explain, well, why he was wanting to rob me and other things like that. And it's like a one-shot interaction. And I think research has documented that actually this bringing together the victim with the offender actually makes the victim feel a lot better than not ever confronting the individual and just being satisfied with imprisonment. But I'm not sure that my response will satisfy you, but I think Tobias has risen up.
Just real quickly, and restorative justice still includes restitution. I used to be in law enforcement. I've seen blood and guts on the TV. My students, even when I taught at a small college in Iowa and helped out police department on site, they'd say, we saw you on the news last night at shooting. And I had members of church that I had to go visit, more than one, who had loved ones murdered. It's a both and. I'm a Catholic. Love your neighbor, but also love your enemy. And I'm not a pacifist. But I try to love both. And I did refer to that a little bit, but that wasn't the topic. But it is really something that we're supposed to be doing for all. And I know a lot of people talk about death penalty or violence, and the victim gets left out. But there are a lot of victims groups now. At St. Louis University, we have a prison program. We offer an AA degree to prisoners in the maximum security prison where they actually execute people. We have violent prisoners going through this, some who are lifers. They are now role models for other prisoners. We're doing studies. Conflict in those hallways are way down. My idea, we also offer this AA for free to the officers who, like me, I went to a community college. I had to work full-time my way through undergraduate. Community college, then state university. I'm the only person in my family that went to college, let alone a PhD. Two of my brothers are high school dropouts, criminal histories. One brother has a high school degree, that's it. So we now offer an AA for free to the staff, the officers at this prison, as well as the inmates, a lot less violent. Also, another suggestion, we offer scholarships to children of murder victims. St. Louis University, a Catholic Jesuit university, trying to be there for all. I think that's what we're supposed to be doing. I'm sorry we couldn't do that three-faceted, balanced approach tonight, but I'm with you. That is important.
Here we go. Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart has stated that Cook County Jail is the largest mental institution in the state of Illinois. How can we help that to not be that large of a problem?
I think the answer in part is to recognize that mental illness does play a key role in criminal offending. You know, by the way, there's far more to crime and violence than what I've talked about. I've talked about the brain. There's the social factors we've known for many years. I'm not denying those at all. Poverty, bad neighborhoods, bad parenting, discrimination, all of these things are very important. But an additional factor is what you've raised, and I'm pleased you have, and that's mental illness. We know that individuals with the disorder of schizophrenia, for example, are on average 4 times more likely to kill than people without schizophrenia, controlling for all other background factors. The same is true for other disorders too. And I think an approach that we do have to take is both greater understanding of what causes crime. And to back off a second, in the justice system, we're asking the question, did he do it? We don't ask, why did he do it? And I think we need to focus more attention on the second question of why do people do it? And sometimes it's for they've got a mental disorder for reasons, again, beyond their control, I think, in part. And we need to redouble our efforts to reduce mental illness, not just in prison populations, but also in society in general, taking a public health approach to trying to reduce crime and violence. Public health approach meaning, you know, let's raise everyone up, whether it's on nutrition or brain functioning or in reducing mental illness amongst all of us in the community, in society. Not just targeting individuals, but raising us all up. Tobias, do you have a perspective on Cook County, mental illness?
Well, I think I agree with what you said, but I would also say, I would add that during the 1980s, under certain administration, we really reduced programs, not only education in prisons, but we also reduced programs with regard to mental health in this country. And so back in the 80s I started in law enforcement in 1984. I thought I was Don Johnson, Miami Vice. I wore a white coat, all that stuff. Too long ago for most of you. But that's when I actually liked working in maximum security jail in the psychiatric wing, but it was full and getting fuller throughout the 80s.
Thank you. And I don't know if you know about Bruce Perry, who's a child psychiatrist, and he's been working for maybe 20 to 30 years looking at children's brains, children who have been abused, neglected, or have had cumulative trauma. And he sees that the brains of these children are smaller than the normal brain, and the amygdala is smaller. And he has a program in Texas, Child Trauma Academy. One of the things that he found was that the more healing relationships a child has, more community relationships, school relationships, the brain changes. But I didn't know if you were familiar with, you hadn't mentioned
Absolutely.
trauma, the effects of trauma and abuse on the brain.
Yeah, if I can chip in first, Tobias, yes, I definitely know of the work, and I redouble the message that the social environment changes the brain to change behavior. So, for example, if you take an infant and vigorously shake it, you will lacerate the white nerve fibers linking the frontal cortex with those emotional regions of the brain. You're effectively conducting a frontal leucotomy. Nobody will see the signs on the baby at all. but it will occur. The social environment can radically affect the brain, just as nutrition is part of the social environment. So again, the message is, biology is not destiny. We can change the biological predispositions giving rise to violence, and Bruce Perry's programs are examples of that. What would be the counter perspective? Because I like to step outside of my own perspective and think, well, what's the counterpoint? I think it goes something like this. It's all very well for people like me and maybe Tobias to say, well, let's raise up the betterment of everyone. It costs a lot of money to raise up everyone and to put a lot of money into these early programs with young children. Bottom line is that there are many young kids that have a bad start to life who seem like the bad egg, and they grow up just fine. There's a lot of developmental change. So some criminologists argue, don't invest in the early years of the child. Instead, invest in that critical time point, maybe at age 15, 16, which is the tipping point, because of a financial issue. Stepping outside of finances, I believe the best investment society can possibly make is investing in the early years of the child, like Bruce Perry. But I think there's a counter perspective that that's costly, it can be a waste of money for a lot of kids, and is there a different approach? Waiting a little later, waiting to the teenage years, and then only jumping in when some really serious problem begins. Tobias?
But if we look long-term, too, really, if we don't address it, even though it's more expensive up front, short-term, long-term, what we're doing right now, our prison, we got more people in prison than any country in this world. It's costing us more than what your tuition costs each year per person. There's a huge cost there. Not only dollar signs, but other costs. So you got to look at it. If you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, take it all the way out.
Yeah, what Tobias is saying is that we make up 5% of the world population, but we make up, I think, 20 or 25% of all incarcerated people. In other words, per capita, we incarcerate 5 times more people than anyone else in the world. And Tobias is saying that's very costly. Take that money, invest it in the early years of these young kids.
One over here.
You're discussing criminal acts, so I'm just curious if you could elaborate more on the fact that it's violent acts. So there are individuals within as a police officer, sometimes you're asked to act violently as an individual in an army or, whatnot. Can you elaborate on career violence almost?
Well, I think you're right that, sometimes violence is adaptive. In warfare, you need to be a psychopath. You need to be at the front and shoot and have no conscience or no remorse or hesitation about pulling the trigger on the enemy. So it's a fascinating question to me. I've talked about lack of fear as something negative, but there are times in life where we need really fearless, brave people. Let me spin it around a bit. There's something I've not talked about tonight, low resting heart rate. It's the best replicated biological correlate of antisocial behavior in kids and adolescents. Low resting heart rate, lack of fear. Well, guess what? Bomb disposal experts in the Army have low resting heart rates relative to soldier controls. Bomb disposal experts, very fearless people, putting their lives at risk to dispose of bombs, they have this lack of fear. But in some situations, that can be very adaptive. So it's an intriguing question to me that if we could wave our magic wand, take away the factors that create fearless criminals, we could take something good away from society. If we could wave a magic wand and take away psychopathy, psychopaths are glib people, they're charming, they are sensation seekers. Don't we take something away from politicians, from leaders in society, successful businessmen who can help drive the rest of society? Don't we need a little bit of the bad egg in society to help us all?
I would just add, in the Catholic tradition, in just war, just policing, you don't celebrate the killing. It's something you mourn. We used to require penance even for soldiers who fought in just war. We don't do that anymore. But yet now we have a lot of soldiers coming back and they say they feel something called, it's being called moral injury because they don't have any way to address that. We used to do that. Police officers, same thing. We used to require penance for executioners. And so killing sometimes is morally justified, but it's not seen as something good and positive. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm in St. Louis. Right now, we're very busy there with a lot of police shootings. I'm almost every day dealing with that. And what's happened in this country, there's been kind of a militarization of the police, and we've got a lot of police that don't have that mentality, that attitude. There might be some that are actually more like, I mean, the line between the badge, I mean, each side of the bars is kind of thin for some. So I would just throw that in there too. And then just the whole thing about fear. In the Catholic tradition, we have this virtue theory. So the opposite of courage is not fear. The opposite of courage is actually a virtue, and there's two extremes that are vices. One vice is recklessness. That's fearlessness. You just go in, that's reckless. Courage is not reckless. Then the other thing is timidity, cowardice. So I would want to tease out more like what we mean by these words, and maybe there's another way to think about this too from the Catholic moral perspective.
Good question.
Hi, Dr. Raine, you did not touch on the little itty-bitty topic in the neuroscience of criminal behavior of genetics, the correlates of genetics and behavior. So if you would not mind, in 30 seconds or less.
30 seconds or less coming up. The book.
And of course, how that relates to the ethics of prevention and treatment.
And ethics of prevention and treatment in 30 seconds, very simple. Twin and adoption studies have documented, again beyond reasonable doubt, that about 50% of the variation amongst us in crime, violence, antisocial proclivities can all be chalked up to genetics. That is beyond any doubt now. You can't go on, I mean, hundreds of studies have documented that. The second question you're raising is, well, what's the implication for treatment? We don't know at the moment because right now we don't know which specific genes out of the 20,000 code for the risk factors that lead to crime and violence. So we've still, unfortunately, got a long, long way to go. Not a satisfactory answer, but my 30 seconds is up.
Okay, I got to ask a question that I wanted to actually share something. Earlier, the moment may have passed, but I'll see if I can recall it, is when we were talking about the violence of policemen and soldiers. And I recently was flipping through a new, like we need a new biography of Joan of Arc. But I just happened to read a little section about after winning a battle against the English, oops, sorry, sir. Oh, history dies hard. After winning a battle against the English, she was seen weeping over the dead English soldier. So I don't think we have to be, the comment that I relate to about this whole thing is one size does not fit all. And there's so many variations, and you've given us so much about that. And now I just want to go back to a British hero for a second. Unpremeditated, but I've heard so many questions about things you did not cover. And it made me think of all the things you did cover that I personally have never heard of before, and was so excited to hear and be introduced to. And the comment that came to my mind was a quote in the biography of Horatio Nelson, which summed up his life as, it's not so much what he did, but what he might have left undone.
Yes, what you might have left undone. You know, the comment that struck a chord in my heart is, weeping for the dead soldiers. And one of the other things I've not talked about is empathy. And, one thing that we believe is that criminals, and especially psychopaths, lack empathy. They lack feeling and compassion for other people. And it goes back to one of the earlier questions. What can we do to better bring on board empathy and understanding and compassion and feeling in people? So again, let's go to treatment. One thing I've not talked about is meditation, and a form of meditation called mindfulness training, which is, to my understanding, a form of meditation that gets us in touch more with our own feelings, what we're feeling, our breathing, our heart rate, and how we're feeling about ourselves. And it's a type of philosophy, to my understanding, which makes us a little bit more compassionate about ourselves. And I'm intrigued about how if you did this mindfulness training with offenders who tend to lack compassion, is it because they lack compassion to themselves, that they're their own worst enemies? And if we can bring offenders back in touch with their own feelings, which may have been lost through years of child abuse from the past, could it be that we bring on board empathy in these individuals and we can release them back into society where they'll be less dangerous to us because they're more in touch with not just their emotions, but in an empathic sense, the emotions of other people? Tobias?
Sounds like love your neighbor as yourself.
Got one over here. Hi. Dr. Raine, you spoke about two different populations tonight. One that would suffer from neurodevelopmental assault in the womb, and obviously the abnormalities that would result from that. You also spoke of those that after maturation who had an assault on their biology, as in the tumor. How do you reconcile, when we talk about morality or leniency, the difference between the two populations, in that the adult would have gone through a whole life with a intact amygdala, hippocampus, and frontal lobe, and yet their behavior is criminal?
Very astute question, because you're right in thinking that there are two different breeds here. Ones who at the get-go there's something wrong, and maybe they never learn right from wrong, almost, or words to that effect. Whereas you've got a second population who are pretty well normal, like the last person we talked about in the video. And then snap, something happens in the brain, a bit like with Tobias and his personal story. And as Tobias said, he's a little bit different after that episode. Do we treat them the same? I don't know. What would you do, Judge? Would you treat them the same if you were a lawyer, if you were a judge, if you were a juror? Well, who would you treat better? Who would you give more compassion to? And why?
The child or the individual that had an early developmental issue would get more leniency than someone who has benefited from years of learned morality and social expectations.
I can understand that. I also heard a wow over here or something, or someone who had a different perspective. I think it would be interesting to hear for a different perspective. I think that's a very good one. I mean, I'm sort of on board with you, but is there a counterpoint, a counter perspective? And I think it's good to hear reasons why. So you would perhaps instead go in the other direction and the reasons why.
Well, I don't think I would have a hierarchy of either side. And as you have said repeatedly, each person has to be taken care of individually, and there has to be a sensitivity to how they got in the place that they got. And a person growing a brain tumor as an adult is just as non-responsible for that happening to him as a child in the womb having a mother that drinks. So the responsibility for that event is neither individual's responsibility.
You know, this is fascinating because when you spoke, I thought, yeah, I'm on board with you. But when you spoke, I thought, yeah, I'm on board with you too. But
that's how he is in his book too. Boy, I
mean,
don't know where he is.
But
you know, it's hard. Here I'm going to go Catholic, and we believe some things that really do involve faith. But Pope John Paul II said, not even a murderer loses that image of God. Aquinas said a murderer is he referred to Aristotle as a beast. We don't have that view anymore, or we're not supposed to. We believe in the inherent unearned, undeserved, regardless of sex, race, age, ethnicity, your abilities, your portfolio, your IQ. We believe every single human being has inherent dignity and value. So we are called to have compassion for all. So I think I'm a little bit more with you. I really get your answer. But at the end of the day, I want to be with you.
Hello, my question is for Dr. Raine. So, from what I understood from your lecture, you were saying that psychopaths should be held less responsible in court for their crimes. However, when we look at individuals who have autism spectrum disorder, they often mimic these lack of empathy personality traits that we often see with psychopaths. However, they have the executive functions to learn rules and laws in society, so they often don't go on to commit crimes. So I'm guessing you would say that psychopaths do not have this executive function?
Psychopaths, we believe, have good executive functioning. They know the right thing to do. It's just that they don't have the feeling for it. Now, you're raising autism spectrum disorders, for example, there. And I'm not an expert on that. Somebody called Simon Baron-Cohen is an expert. He's written a book called The Science of Evil. And he's talking there about how autism spectrum disordered individuals can actually do some bad things. Now, not to make too much of one case, the Sandy Hook killings, for example, diagnosis there was Asperger's syndrome. Now, that's not to say that all Asperger's go and shoot up schools. No, absolutely not. But it's certainly true that Asperger's don't have the cognitive empathy. They can't put themselves in somebody else's shoes and understand how they feel. Psychopaths can. They know how you feel. And that's why they're so good at pushing our buttons, because they can read our minds. But they don't have the feeling for what we go through. Simon Baron-Cohen argues that Asperger's syndrome individuals do have emotional feelings for others. They collect stray dogs, stray cats. They feel sorry for people who are hurt. But they don't have a cognitive understanding. So they have the they're emotionally there, whereas psychopaths are not. So there's an argument there for a difference between the two. By the way, just as a word of reflection, when you said, I'm arguing that we should treat psychopaths more easily because they have these deficits, there's part of me that really shrinks away from that. But I did say it.
May I ask the audience a question real quickly? Lombroso, he is kind of the father, the Jack the Ripper case in London, all that, profiling. You like those shows with the serial murder cases and the profiler? We like that, we're fascinated. Although, when you hear profiling with policing in another context about race, we don't like that. Where did that come from? This stuff. And it was originally not behavioral, it was biological. These markers that were mentioned up here. Not race, skin color, but where are your ears? Those kinds of things, your finger. Now, the sociobiological, the combination, you can't separate the behavioral from the biological, I think. That's right. But for most profiling today that's regarded as good, it's about behavioral cues. But I think, I'm persuaded, I don't know if it's beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it is a preponderance of the evidence type of persuasion that the sociobiological are connected, intermeshed. So what do you think about that, about profiling?
Like racial profiling?
Is this like racial profiling? If you've got the information about people who have a predisposition, it's not necessarily causal, but this correlation is predisposition. Not everybody does it, but it is more likely that persons with Asperger's are going to do something like this. What are your thoughts? Use the mic. Yeah.
Racism does not have factual basis supporting it, whereas I would argue that biology has more. I mean, in both cases, you're looking at correlations, but I don't think that it's right to say that a predisposition to be a criminal linked to race is the same as a predisposition to be a criminal linked to biology. I think that's a dangerous thing to tow with.
There are people that make that claim, though. Yeah, I'm not.
Right.
But I want to know what you all think.
So what you're saying is that racial prejudice doesn't have a scientific backing, whereas what I'm talking about, I'm not talking at all about race. I'm talking about links between biology and crime, and it's scientific. So you're saying it's on a different wavelength.
Yes, I would say that in regards to what you're speaking of, that's much more ethical, and it doesn't give anyone, it's not predisposing anyone to historical oppressions that have happened, whereas when we're speaking of race, there's a lot of historical elements that come in that may factor into people being in a certain neighborhood with more tendencies to have certain crime rates.
Once upon a time, though, race was a factor in this equation, even at Lombroso. And better science now is saying what you're saying. But is there still the risk? I mean, I hope our science down the road is going to be better than what we have now. And is there a risk that some of what's we've got now, we're going to...
So you're saying that potentially this could be something that we look back on and say, wow, we were really wrong by stereotyping people for having these certain...
Possibly.
Yeah, it is possible.
Great. We could continue to dialogue all night, and I know Dr. Raine will stay and sign books, and I'm sure Dr. Winright will stay and talk. We have cookies and juice. I just want to say again, a sincere thanks to our speakers who have really engaged us and enlightened us.
Thank you, guys. Great. Good question.